Welcome to the God's Goodness Podcast, where our mission is to encourage and highlight God's goodness and modern-day miracles. We're your hosts, Josh and Shelley Hankins. Today we have with us a special guest. You've met him before in the podcast. He's been on a few times, and this time he's going solo. We have Pastor John Kent with us, sharing more tales of his mission work in Papua New Guinea. And we ask for a little grace because we are recording remotely. I am getting over a cold, and we didn't want to spread that, but we still wanted to spread the goodness of God, and so we're still recording. So bear with us, and then there might be dogs. So if you hear them, just, life happens, but we're still going to get the word out. And with that, we'll have Pastor John open us with an opening prayer.
Okay. Thank you, Josh and Shelley, for inviting me on again. Let's pray. Oh, Lord, just so very honored for the privilege of serving you. So honored, Lord, that somehow you see value in us and that you choose us. You want us to matter. Today, Lord, as we talk, may this conversation and whatever stories I tell, may they truly bring honor and glory to you. Thank you, Jesus, for hearing our prayer. Amen.
Amen.
So for our listeners, I've always told Pastor John he should write a book, and I'm not the only one who's told him that. And so these are some of the tales that might be in a book one day. So now we get to hear them firsthand and before the book comes out. So
Allegedly comes out.
Yeah. After retirement. So where would you like to start today?
I was thinking as I sat down, Josh and Shelley, I just really do want to begin with a word of scripture, if that's okay.
Oh, yes.
Yesterday, down in my chair where I study and pray and had my Bible, it fell open in my lap, just came to this verse, and I thought it was a significant verse given some of the things I was pondering and dealing with. But it comes from Ezekiel 37. If you are familiar with that chapter, it's the chapter of the dry bones. And God shows Ezekiel this valley full of bones, and he asks if they can live. And Ezekiel responds, only you know, Lord. And then, God sends his spirit. He sends a wind. He prophesies. He tells Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones. And there's a whole bunch of clattering, and the bones all come together. And then, eventually sinew are on them, but they're still not breathing. And then Ezekiel prophesies for that to come. And all of a sudden they stood on their feet and lived a mighty army, it says. And verses 13 and 14, as God is speaking to Ezekiel, he says this, and you shall know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. And I just love that promise, you guys, that, in the places, whether it's New Guinea or Bridgeville or wherever it is, whatever point in time in our lives when things seem challenging and difficult, and it feels like it's hopeless. How can these bones live, Yet when God sends his spirit, radical transformation happens. And I'm really grateful for that, and I'm really grateful of how that connects to the stories we're going to share today.
I couldn't help but be reminded of that one song, Dry Bones, Hear the Word of the Lord. Live, live. Anyway, go on.
I was thinking the dry bones come alive.
Yeah, the Lauren Daigle song is a great song. Yeah. I thought I'd begin with a story. We had been in New Guinea among the Iwam people for a year or two, I suppose. And we had this message that came out of the jungle from a place called Ipamoo. And the message came, and it said, please come to see us. We want to learn about God you're teaching the Iwam. And so, a little time went by, apparently, the transformational work that God was doing among the Iwam had begun to trickle, the news had begun to trickle into the far deeper jungle, even deeper than we were. So a little time went by and another message came. And so one Friday morning I got up. I took a friend, one of my friends as a guide, and we began to make our way toward this people. Now, what's interesting is that this tribal group was a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer people, whereas the Iwam were a river-based people with permanent dwellings. The Ipamoo people were people that just roamed the jungle, eating rats, bats, bugs, snakes. If it lived, they ate it.
Wow. But they wanted to hear about Jesus.
Yeah, they'd heard about what we were doing, and news of God's transformational work in the Iwam had trickled back there. And so I had never contacted this tribe. I didn't know anything about them. And only later did I find out I was the first Westerner to actually make contact with this tribe.
Hmm.
But I got up on a Friday morning, I grabbed a little bit of food, and we took off. And, up to this point in time, among the Iwam, there was always food to eat somewhere. Even if it was something I didn't like, there was something to eat, right? And so I ate a little breakfast that morning, and then we took off. And we went down the river in our 15-foot dinghy and turned into a tributary. And we made our way for several hours in that until the swamp actually closed in so tight that we couldn't go forward anymore. And just about that place, we found this little log canoe. So we got out and we climbed into the canoe and we began paddling. And by the way, men in New Guinea have to stand up in their log canoe to paddle. Only women sit down. So that's a whole skill set in its own that I had to learn.
Do you know why? Is there a belief system behind that, or is it just...
It's just a cultural practice. Men stand. It probably, I'm going to guess, I never really explored that, Josh, but I'm going to guess that in more violent times that a man standing had a far better chance of seeing something a little farther out than if he was sitting. But honestly, I don't know the detailed answer to that question. All I know is that women always sat, men always stood. And anyway, a challenging skill to learn. I provided hours of entertainment to the Iwam when I was learning how to paddle a little narrow canoe standing. I did a lot of swimming. So anyway, we paddled for a number of hours and then finally got to where we couldn't do that. And we began to walk. And, what you have to put in your mind here is we're not looking for a permanent village. We're looking for signs of human movement, right? We're looking for a footprint, a trail, anything that would indicate that people have been here.
So would they carry fire with them too? When you mentioned before with the Iwam that fire was not impossible to make, but if they had one going, they would do the best they could to preserve it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because without matches or lighters, getting the spark going is really challenging, especially in a wet environment. So they would do everything they could to protect, a fire or a burning ember. So, but the jungle sticks, so you can't really look for smoke or even much smell unless you're really, really close. But so, we're kind of making our way. My helper knows kind of the direction we're going, but these people would just move into an area. They would eat everything around that area out, and then they would move on. And so we were gone all day, hours and hours and hours. And finally, about 5:30, 6 o'clock, just before sundown, we step into this clearing. And on the other side of the clearing are a group of the Ipamoo people. And they took one look at me, you guys, and they ran in sheer terror into the jungle. They had no idea that I was the thing they sent for.
Wow.
They'd never seen anything like me, and they literally thought I was an evil spirit.
Wow.
It took my helper about 20, 30 minutes to convince them that I was the thing that they sent for. And by the way, their language was different also. They didn't speak. They had a different language from the Iwam. My helper knew it a little bit.
Oh, wow.
And there's a trade language that most tribes in New Guinea know, but this tribe did not know it very well at all because they had very little contact with even other tribal groups. And so, they're living about as remotely as you're going to find anywhere on planet Earth. they finally received the idea that I'm the thing they sent for. And so they take us to their little makeshift village, and there's these little sticks, an inch or two in diameter, and, stilted houses on these little sticks, 4 or 5 feet off the ground. And so we climbed up into the hut and put up our mosquito nets and came back down, I at least assuming that they would give us some food, but they did not. And we've been all day long without a single bite of food. And we're not, sitting twiddling our thumbs. We're on the boat and then rowing and then hiking, or not rowing, but paddling and then hiking and under the heat of the equatorial sun. And they didn't offer us a single bite of food. So we went to bed that night really hungry and got up the next day. And again, I kind of expected we'd get some food, but they didn't offer me a single bite of food. Maybe still wondering if I was a spirit. Maybe they thought spirits didn't eat. But the truth be told, though, I did not see a single person put food in their mouth that entire weekend. Now, they may have been going out and pulling grubs out of the ground or eating something that I did not see. But I didn't see anybody put food in their mouth. And they're just very skinny. They're survivors. They're roaming and just eating what is available in a given moment. And so, just on the edge of survival. And so we spent that first day with them, beginning trying to establish relationship, trying to communicate. We began our first attempts at trying to communicate the idea of a God, a Christian God, a God that's full of love and compassion toward people rather than spirits that have to be manipulated and appeased continually. It was a challenging day as we sat there, sometimes just looking at one another and trying our best to communicate. And so we spent the first day with them and then got up Sunday morning, and I spent till about 10 o'clock with them. We continued to, just in the very simplest of ways, seek to communicate to them about God. And finally, about 10 o'clock in the morning, we decided to begin to reverse the trek. Well, this is the third day without food. And so now we begin this trek back hours and hours through the jungle. And we finally get to the canoe. Well, we got in the canoe, we paddled for several hours. We finally got to the boat late afternoon, only to find that the entire river swamp level has dropped 2 feet over the weekend. And so instead of being able to use the outboard motor, I had to crawl into the swamp and push the boat. And I just want to tell you guys, that took about another 2 hours. And I want to tell you that by the time I got into the boat, I was so weak. We were so weak from hunger. It was terrible. And I looked at the time. Well, I didn't have to look at a watch. I don't even know if I had one. But, I knew there was no way we were getting home. We were going to have to spend another night in the jungle. But we got the outboard fired up and started down the river. And we come into Ipamoo territory. And there's a village coming up that, I know that village, I know that leader, and I know he'll give us a place to eat, a place to stay. I'm already thinking about food, right, in my story.
Right.
And so as we near the village, this crazy thing happened. It was the first time I'd ever seen it. There were these bugs. I call them like a mayfly. They had a body probably 1.5 inches or 2 inches long and a wing spread probably 2 inches or so wide, but their entire life was lived in the water. And in the space of 2 or 3 hours, these things would hatch. They would hatch, they'd come to the surface, they'd start flying, they'd begin breeding, laying eggs, and dying all by literally the millions. It was literally, Josh and Shelley, like we were on the boat, sliding over the surface of the water, but literally like going through a snowstorm, a blizzard of white, flying, breeding, laying eggs, and dying bugs.
That's gross.
And, they're flying like 3 feet off the surface of the water, from surface level right up to 3 feet. They're just, it's just like going through a mass cloud of these things. And we're going down the river through these things. And I'm just astounded by it. And as we get near the village, all of a sudden there's a bunch of ladies out there in their little log canoes. And they've got their canoes and turned semi-perpendicular to the flow of the water. And these bugs are coming down and heaping up against the sides of the canoe. And then they're scooping these bugs into bark baskets that they have in their canoes. And as we go by there, I say to myself, what in the world are they doing with those?
Lunch.
You know where this is going?
I was wondering why you wouldn't open your mouth in the snowstorm if you were that hungry.
Maybe I should have thought of that, Josh. But yeah, so we ran around them, got down to the village, and the village leader came down and he sees me and I said, hey, can we stay here tonight? We've been in the deep bush here for several days. And he said, oh yeah, no problem. You can stay at my hut. And then I said to him, listen, do you have any food for us to eat? We have been 3 days without a bite of food. And he said, no problem. Just come on. So we go up to the house, put up our mosquito nets, and I sit down. And pretty soon, you guys, they bring in these green leaf packages all wrapped up. And they throw them on the fire, and they begin to cook. And I am sitting there salivating like a mad dog. And for some reason, I have no idea what's in those packages. And after a little bit, they say, they're done. And then they plop one in front of me. And I reach down and I rip it open. I am so hungry. And I look at this mush of 10,000 steamed bugs. And I look at those bugs. And I look at the man. And I look at the bugs.
He was so happy to give it to you, I'm sure.
Oh, he was. And I look at the man and I said, surely you must have something in this house besides bugs. And he looked at me like I was nuts. He reached up in the rafters and he pulled down a coal black fish that looked like it had been up there for 6 months, and he laid it down beside the bugs.
Gross.
I want to tell you, it was hard.
You're like, how hungry am I? This reminds me of Wendy Lawson. She's like, when you're hungry, you'll eat it. You'll eat anything. Yeah. Monkey balls, anything.
I don't know about all that. I think
I don't know about
I think there's a healthy respect to hunger that we can have.
I know. I definitely would have been hangry, not having eaten.
From fasting for 40 days, I can tell you that. What's one more day?
Well, it's different if it's like an optional, like I chose the fast, but if it's like
a forced fast.
A forced fast. It's a little different. But all the while, I'm still leaning on God's strength to get me through it.
Anyway, man, guys, I looked down. I ate that fish, head, tail, eyeballs, the works, and had lunch for dessert.
Oh, my gosh.
So gross.
I'm wondering how they know, like, oh, yep, this is done. These are done now.
Right, yeah,
stop popping.
That was quite the experience, but that's actually just the springboard or the ramp into the Ipamoo people. So eventually the next morning I get home, and when I get home, for some weeks there was a guy there that I met by the name of Bob. He just seemed very interested, and I'm wrestling with the idea of how do I reach a semi-nomadic people who don't settle in a single place. How do I reach people that just roam and you don't know where they're at all the time? And so a few weeks went by, maybe even a month or two, and I'm wrestling with how do we do this, praying about it. And I took a trip down, one of our trips, quarterly trips out to town. And on the trip, I go into a store, and just so interesting, and this always amazed me about New Guinea, there was this little frontier provincial headquarters of WEWAC, but it had a Christian bookstore, of all things. And I went into the Christian bookstore in that little town, and there on the shelf were a set of 2 or 3 tape recorders, cassette players, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Cassette players. But the interesting thing was they required no batteries.
Huh.
Or electricity. They had a little hand crank on them. And if you spun, you could, it had all the little buttons like a regular old cassette player had. An eject, a little thing that opened up, open and put your cassette in, close it, and then hit the play button. But nothing happened until you started winding the crank.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at that and I thought, I could maybe do that. I could record Bible stories on cassettes. And then I could take that player back into Bob and give it to him and teach him how to use it. And maybe they could listen to the Bible. And so that's what I did. I bought it. I brought it back. And then over a series of weeks, I recorded a long series of Bible stories chronologically. And I took those cassettes and I color coded them so that they could know which one came next. And I took a little sheet of paper, and they couldn't read or write. They'd never been to school or had no education or training of any kind. But I just put a series of dots on a paper that corresponded with the color of the cassette. And so I recorded that, by the way, all in their language, or all in the trade language, that would be. And so eventually I got that done, and I took my helper, and we went back. And this time I took food with me, by the way.
No doubt.
I took crackers and ramen. Anyway, I went back in, and...
Now, how long did that take you to record those?
Oh, I don't remember, a number of weeks it took me to sit down between everything else I was doing.
Okay.
And, just recording those cassettes. And then when I was done, made arrangements to go in. And so I took my helper and we went back, and I sat down with Bob. And I showed him the cassette player, and I showed him the cassettes, and I showed him the sheet, and I showed him all the color codes. And I sat with him, and I had to actually show him how to turn it. He'd never done anything at all like that, like a movement that went round and around and around with his hand. And I'll never forget to this day when he pushed the little button and began winding, when the voice came out of the cassette player, just the shock on his eyes. To hear my voice coming out of the box. But, so I took him, and I took that and left it, and then left, put it in his hands, and returned back to May River to continue on work. And then so a number of weeks, even a couple of months went by again. Time moves slowly and quickly in the jungle. But I said, I need to go back in. I need to go back there and try and find them and see how they're doing. And so, Josh and Shelley, this has always truly astounded me. We went back into the jungle, and we eventually found them once again. And the tribal group had decided that they were going to, rather than trying to listen to stories every day, they were going to take one day a week, that the whole tribe would stop, and that they would pause on that day, and that all they would do would be listen to the Bible stories.
Sounds like a Sabbath to me.
And it actually was, Shelley. They actually, without calendars or time or watches, they actually chose the seventh day of the week. Awesome. They had no idea. And they would just take turns winding the crank. Just winding the crank, around and around and around, and listening to the story. And God just began to transform them from a fear-based tribal group living in fear and manipulation of spiritual forces toward an understanding, a loving response to God. And somewhere, I will never forget, I have a picture, and this actually happened after we left. I went downriver. We moved downriver the last 2 years we were in the country. And while we were away, living in another spot, Bob was baptized, he and several others. And I have a picture of him, and I'll see if I can find it for you.
Cool.
And just the joy on his face and the gleam in his eye is just amazing. It's amazing to see the difference in his face, in his life, just from receiving Jesus. And so that's going to springboard us into one more story. And that's the story of Sabian. His Sabian story also intersects with this story. So when we first moved to the May River, we were a novelty. And by that, I mean Blinn and I were the novelty, right? People, we were just strange and different and living among this people. But people began to respond. And, we've told you the story of Ben and what happened out of that story. And pretty soon we had, a number of baptisms. But there was a man by the name of Sabian and his wife Manau. And Sabian he was not interested in Christianity at all. He had no interest in it. His father had died recently, and there was a series of spiritual rituals that they had to go through that took a long time. Sometimes it can take a couple of years to fully complete some of these rituals.
Wow.
And to ensure that the dead, are as safe as they can be. Sabi was afraid if he became a Christian that it would mess with that, right? That his father might get angry, his dead father might get angry and come back to cause harm if things weren't done correctly. And so, I just had a real burden for him. I loved this man. I loved his wife, but they weren't responding. Then one day, Sabian's daughter, probably 2-3-year-old daughter, got very ill. Maybe even less. She was probably around 1. She got really ill. And for the Iwam people, they do not allow their children to cry. Because if an infant, if a child cries and doesn't stop, it risks losing its spirit and dying.
Wow.
And so in their system, they do everything possible to keep a child from crying because they already have a 50% infant mortality rate.
Wow.
And you're doing everything you can to keep your children alive. But their little daughter, I remember now, she's less than a year. She got sick and she would not stop crying. And she cried through an entire night and an entire day. And they did all the rituals they knew how to do to pacify her and stop her. And she just wouldn't stop and went through another night. And she just continued in this incessant crying and whimpering. And filled with fear, they came to the end of their rope because their rituals clearly weren't working. And so they put their little baby, their infant, into a canoe, and they started paddling upriver. And they paddled actually right past my house. They went up around the corner to the next little village where there was a young couple by the name of Marcus and Siaku. And Marcus and Siaku were among our very first converts, our first group of 10 that gave their hearts to Jesus. And by the way, they're still serving that church today, all these many years later.
Wow.
Faithfully leading the church there. But they paddled up to Marcus and Siaku. They brought their canoe to rest on the little sandbar in front of Marcus and Siaku's house. And they began to walk up the sandbar toward the house. And Marcus and Siaku came down and they asked what was happening. And Sabian told them, our daughter won't stop crying and we've done all the rituals and she just won't stop. And we've decided we need to try your God. Would you pray to your God for our daughter? And so Marcus and Siaku got down on their knees. They took that little baby into their hands and they began to pray. And Josh and Shelley, the moment they began to pray, that baby stopped crying.
So good.
The moment they prayed, the baby stopped crying.
The moment.
That just made this huge, huge, huge impression on Sabian. It just made a big impression on him. And so pretty soon he began pursuing, we began to, teach him the Bible, teach him the stories of the Bible, teach him about Jesus. And eventually he and his wife were baptized. But that experience just deeply embedded in Sabian the idea that God heard prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And he began to be, he just began to respond to God, to be faithful to God. I think he was one of the first people that ever brought tithe to the church. It was 2 ears of corn. He brought 2 ears of corn and put it on the front bench and said, I'm giving this to God. And I remember that day, it brought me to tears just to see him do it, just to begin thinking about how do I respond to the grace of God in my life. And Sabian actually became very powerful in prayer. Several people were healed through his prayers. And then there was the day that Sabian and a bunch of the villagers, they went to work in their gardens. And when I say the word garden, you have to think differently than here. Here we have these nicely tilled plots. But for the Iwam, it's not done in rows. The ground's not plowed. They actually have to go and cut trees down and slash off the jungle, slash all the bush back and burn it. And after, quite some time, it's a planned process. And after a time, then they have to go and just with a digging stick, begin punching holes in the ground to put their cow in. It's a version of a sweet potato or bananas or greens or whatever they're going to plant. And as he's doing that, he's out there in the garden and, there's a bunch of his other, family and villagers out there planting, and he gets really discouraged. He gets really, really discouraged because he said, I don't know why I do this, because the pigs, all the wild pigs, are just going to come eat this. They're just going to come eat it, and it's just going to be a waste. And why should I do this, just to feed the pigs?
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
The Iwam don't build fences, and it's a real challenge because if you plant your crops or your food down at river level, 50% or more of those are going to get flooded out by rain, by floods, by the river going over the banks. And if you put it on the mountains, on the hillsides, then the wild animals, especially the pigs, will come and ravage it. And so he's just standing there in the middle of his garden, just in frustration. And then he remembers God. He remembers how God has been hearing his prayers. And so he just kneels in the middle of his garden. And he just says, Lord, I love you and I'm trying to follow you. And here's my garden. And if you don't intervene, most of it's just going to be eaten by the pigs. And I don't want that. So he said, I'm just asking you to protect my garden. Would you protect my garden as a witness to my family and friends that you are alive, that you are real? And he prayed and he committed that garden to the Lord, and he left. And several months later, Josh and Shelley, this has been one of the most astounding things. While all the other gardens in the region had been ravaged by pigs, the same as always, not one pig even so much as put his footprint inside Sabian's garden.
That's awesome.
And yeah, just an amazing thing. And then, so to intersect the two stories of the Ipamoo people and Sabian, Sabian became our first Iwam missionary. Because I knew that, the cassette tapes could only go so far. The people need a living witness to share the gospel. They need a living testimony. They need a living word to really help them understand and experience God. So Sabian and his wife became the very first Iwam missionaries that we sent out from the Iwam people to another tribal group. And they went back to the Ipamoo people and began teaching and sharing and modeling, and it was because of their work that Bob was eventually baptized.
Awesome.
That is really, really cool.
Talk about a hedge of protection. God.
Talk about, winning someone, right? So God answers this man's deepest desire through the prayers of believers. And, he challenges God in this, right? He says that nothing that we do works. Maybe the guy that you pray to has the answer. And then the guy that they prayed to had the answer. And so, later on, he goes and relies on the same knowledge that he answered me before. He can do it again, right? So boldly prayed again and saw an answer again. I could see why he became a missionary. I can see why he decided that he was going to give his life to God, because God clearly was giving everything to him that he asked for.
Yeah. And for me, that's why it links back also to the verse from Ezekiel. I will put my spirit within you, and you will live. And I will place you in your land, and you will know that I am the Lord, that I have spoken, and I will do it. It's such a beautiful testament of God's grace in their lives. It all began with eating bugs.
But, with turning bugs down. You weren't man enough for the bugs, so they gave you level 2, which was, I believe, the harder challenge. I think I would have rather ate the bugs than the black fish they pulled out that was black for what reason?
Yeah, they were just up there drying. It had probably been semi-smoked somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Nope. I'd rather eat the bugs. At least they'd be fresh.
Yeah, I want to tell you what, brother. If you'd have looked at that pile of bugs, you might question that decision.
If I'd have looked at that fish, that decision would have been over, though. I'd have been in those bugs. Or I'd have just, said, I'm not hungry, and suffered a little longer. You've met me. I'm not going to starve to death.
Wow. At the beginning, when the prayer was answered, but then not the way we expected, it's like, oh, never mind, God. It's like, did I really want that? It's just, things might not look how we expect them to look like, but they'll be good because God had them in mind.
John, I want to thank you so much for being so faithful and obedient to the call of God in your life, so that you have these stories to share with us, right? You have something to show for the little bit that he left you responsible for, right? And then he keeps giving you stuff to be responsible for, and you keep crushing it out of the park, which is probably why you'll be 80-something before you actually retire. I'm really impressed with you leaning into what you feel God is directing you to, even before you knew you had all the pieces that you needed from him, right? You were still a broken man when you started following the call that he had for you. And, you and your wife both suffered on that journey before you had some healing. And I know that healing that you had wasn't the end all, right? That there's still more on the journey. And you're just proof that following what God has for you leads to, first of all, glory for God, and second of all, personal fulfillment. I feel that you both feel very fulfilled in what you've done for him and what you're continuing to do for him. And I really love your obedience to his heart, even when you didn't have it sorted out. I wish that would be the takeaway for some people, is you don't have to have it all sorted out to follow God. He's going to iron you out as you go through. It doesn't have to be a perfect, flawless thing in the beginning.
Yeah. It's like when you're going to work, not all the lights will be green, but, just take one at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely. God doesn't wait for us to have it all together. He doesn't wait for us to be perfect. He knows our hearts. And he knows, for me, I don't know what I would have done had I not been called to this. It's hard to imagine ongoingly broken my life would be. But it's in responding to the leading of God that, and pressing in, that we learn the lessons and we grow to be like Jesus. And I'm so grateful. I am so, so grateful that he doesn't wait for us. A few years ago, I was reflecting on stories of Scripture, and you can go back in Scripture, and Moses, he killed a guy. and God used him.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And David committed adultery and killed a guy, and God used him.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul killed a bunch of people. God still saw value in him and used him. And so I've often said to myself, I haven't even killed anybody yet. So maybe God can use me.
That you know of.
That I know of. There you go.
I would hope you would be aware.
But yeah, it's an astounding thing. You know, it's just preached 2 sermons today. Scriptures, and you know, this amazing truth is across the expanse of the universe, God looks down. He sees you, Josh, and you, Shelley, and he sees me, and everybody listening to this podcast. He sees us, and more than seeing us, he sees value in us. He loves us for who we are, just as we are. And he just begins investing his heart into our hearts so that we begin to become more and more like him. But I'm just so grateful for the love of God.
Me too. This sanctification thing is definitely a process, and God's so gentle with us too. And he just takes and lets us go at our own pace and just takes our hand step by step. I love it.
Mm-hmm. I'm grateful that God shows us that he loves us. It's not just some blank, hollow words that are written down, right? That he shows us through the things he gives us. He shows us through the things he's already given us.
The details.
The comfort that he shares. Like, there's so many things that he does to prove that he loves us.
And that he's listening.
Like, I don't have to have that he loves me on faith. That part I don't need faith for. I know that he loves me. I can rest assured that he loves me, that he cherishes me, right? There's no longer faith in my heart for that because that's just true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for another episode with us, Pastor John. This is awesome. I love your stories. And listener, if you have been blessed by this or any of our episodes, we ask that you share it with a friend so they can be encouraged as well. And then we also have an email list that you can sign up for, and the link is in the About section. And you'll click on that. If you know your name and email, you'll be able to sign up for that and get it sent each week. We have a new episode every Friday at noon, so tune in, be encouraged, and share it with others. And don't forget, you can rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts and in Facebook, and it helps us get the word out. So don't forget to share the post and like the post. It helps. And also, God has blessed us with a studio, so we're going to be getting that set up, and your donations help with that. And there's a link in the About section for that. For our fundraising campaign, there's options to give for that, and we would so appreciate that help. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.